Hi everyone, today I'm excited to be sharing work that I've been doing with Sherry Liu and Liz Spelke on early goal representations. As adults, we readily infer others' goals from their actions. Looking at this child, for instance, you might reason that he wants something on that shelf. Our ability to represent others' goals is at the core of what makes us social beings, enabling us to learn from others, predict others' actions, and to cooperate with others. The present work asks, how do infants come to represent others' goals? In classic work by Amanda Woodward, 5, 6, and 9-month-olds repeatedly saw a person reaching for one object over another, in this case a bear over a ball. Infants habituated to these displays expect that the person will continue reaching for the same original object when those objects later switch locations. Specifically, infants look longer to reach to a different object rather than to the original object. Now, such findings have inspired over 2 decades of research on how infants come to form such expectations, and one perspective is that they do so through their own experience. By 5 months of age, infants can typically reach by themselves. They may appreciate others' goals from their own experience, forming goals and acting on them. Indeed, 3-month-old infants who typically do not reach by themselves look equally to the test trials in this paradigm here. This leaves open the question, however, of what younger, pre-reaching infants have yet to learn about others' goals and actions. Now, one possibility is that 3-month-olds may appreciate others' goals, but not yet know that reaching allows for causal, intentional actions on objects. In the classic Woodward paradigm, a person here just reaches for and grasps objects. They don't do anything with them. If young infants don't yet know that reaching and grasping allows people to act on and manipulate objects, it could potentially lead to the null findings that have been observed in past work. Evidence in support of this possibility comes from work that Sherry Liu has led that has found that 3-month-olds better appreciate the efficiency of reaching when reaching causes objects to change state, in this case light up and play a sound. This account would predict that infants may be more sensitive to the goals of others' reaches if reaching has effects on objects. Even if reaching is seen as causal, though, it might not be clear why a person reaches for an object. In the standard paradigm of Amanda Woodward, a person reaches not only for the same object, but for the same object in the same location here. It might not be clear to infants whether the person reaches for this object because of what it is or because of where it is. In test trials, then, a person is reaching not only for a different object, but for a different object in the original location that they'd reached to in habituation. And they're not only reaching for an original object, but for the original object in a different location than what they'd reached to prior. That's to say, there is a source of novelty both ways, and if younger infants aren't yet sure about which of these might matter more, they might look equally to the 2 test events here. This possibility is consistent with evidence that 3-month-old infants negatively evaluate a hinderer like the square here who prevents a protagonist like the circle from climbing up a hill. This work by Kylie Hamlin suggests that 3-month-olds are sensitive to goals that are based on locations. All this is to say that disambiguating an object's intrinsic properties, what an object is, from its location, where an object is, may enhance infants' ability to represent objects as the goals of others' reaches. The present experiments aim to test both these possibilities, that 3-month-old infants may appreciate others' goals, but not yet know that reaching allows for causal actions, and that that some properties of objects may be more relevant than others for a person's goal. Our first experiment tested the first possibility. We aimed to show babies that reaching allows for causal action. This was done in person prior to the pandemic. We habituated infants to displays involving a person reaching for one object over another. The person causes objects to change color and play a sound. Both objects change color here because we wanted to avoid lower level explanations for any positive findings that we might get. That they may be seeing one object change color for the first time later on come test trials. Importantly, though, the person should only be seen as causing the color change of the ball here, given that she only contacts that object. In test trials, the person comes back to find that the objects have switched locations. The question here is, what will she reach for? Will she reach for a different object or for the original object in a different location? We've labeled the trials here to highlight the potential sources of novelty for both trial types. If the reason that pre-reaching 3-month-olds failed in past work is because they don't know that reaching is causal, then they may now look longer to reaches for a different object. If, though, they had failed in past work to form expectations because they don't yet privilege what an object is versus where an object is, then infants may look equally to the two trial types here. And so what do we find? Let me orient you to the graph here first. On the x-axis, we've got the particular trial type. On the y-axis, we've got infants' looking time in seconds. We find that there's no difference in their looking times for the two trial types here. In this box plot, the diamonds represent means, the lines connect data coming from a single infant, and the beta here is a measure of standardized effect size. Infants don't appear to be distinguishing between the two test events. That's to say, then, the causal information wasn't sufficient alone to get infants to appreciate others' object goals. We therefore next explored the second possibility, that infants might not yet know what properties of objects are more relevant to one's goal, what an object is versus where an object is. In our first experiment, the person had been reaching for one object over another, but always in the same location in habituation. It might not have been clear then that the person was reaching for an object because of what it was rather than where it was, and they may therefore have struggled to predict what the person would do in test trials. In our second experiment, we aimed to provide infants with evidence that the person here is reaching for a particular object, regardless of where it is. Infants may therefore be more likely to recognize that what an object is matters more than where it is, and they may then be better able to predict what the person will do come test trials. Now, our new experiment here was done over Zoom, given the pandemic. We habituated infants to someone reaching for one object over another, regardless of its location. The person again causes effects on objects upon contacting them. In test trials, the person returns here. Now the object that he reached to in habituation is now somewhere totally new that he hasn't reached for before. The non-preferred object is now in a location that he had sometimes reached to. The question here is, what will the person reach for? If infants had failed earlier in experiment 1 because they didn't privilege what an object was over where it was, then they may succeed now that we've disambiguated those two accounts. They may look longer to reach for a different object rather than to reach for something in a different location here. And indeed, that's what we find, that infants are looking differently here. You'll notice that there's a quite obvious visual outlier here. Even after doing analyses with and without outliers, our finding remains significant here. These findings then shed light on the question of what infants think when people reach for and act on objects. Previous null findings in 3-month-old infants suggest that infants may be naive until they have experience themselves. But the question that comes from that is why that might be, and our work provides an answer. Our work suggests that infants may be open-minded about others' goals. Where past work has confounded what an object is with where it is in habituation, when we separated those two accounts and gave infants causal information in our second experiment, infants appeared sensitive to the goals of others reaching. Our findings suggest that infants understand that agents have goals, but they have to learn still about what others want, which actions help them get what they want, and how. In future work, we hope to figure out whether disambiguating what and where an object is may be sufficient to get the effects here. It may be that reaching may also need to be causal. A further key remaining question is whether infants represent locations as the goals of others reaching. If the critical distinction between our two experiments here is that our first experiment included conflicting information about which properties are relevant to a person's goal, then infants may be able to also attribute location-based goals to a person's reaching. Seeing a person reach for whatever's on the left here, regardless of what's there, for example, infants may infer that the left location matters more than what a particular object is, and predict then that the person will continue to reach to the left later, even when there's something new there. We're testing that possibility in ongoing work now. At this time, I'd like to thank my co-authors, Sherry Liu and Liz Spelke, so much for their support with this. I'd like to thank as well the lab, all my funding sources, and participants and families for their support with this work. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm happy to connect either over email or Twitter.